Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Crazy Money. This is Paul Ollinger, your host, but you knew that. It's a damn fine day to be alive, and I'm glad you're with me because I got a great show for you. Our guest, she is Dr. Laurie Santos, professor of psychology at Yale University, whose course, Psychology and the Good Life, is the most popular course in the history of Yale. The history of Yale. And that started on October 9th, 1701. I've never seen the date of a school's actual founding. Like, I've always seen like Harvard was founded in like 1636, I think. But like, I don't know what day it was. October 9th, 1701 is when Yale was founded. So that's, I don't know if it was in the afternoon or the morning or if it was daylight savings time or anything. But anyway, it's a long history, and Dr. Santos is teaching the most popular course in its history. So we'll have a great conversation with her in just one moment. Before we get to that, let me say welcome to the fans of Stacking Benjamins, which is an amazing podcast I got to be on this week. It's hosted by Joe and OG right there out of Joe's mom's basement. Legitimately funny, dry humor. And if you like dry humor, maybe you like this show and maybe you like their show. It's great investment advice and financial planning type stuff. So if you're into that, check out Stacking Benjamins. Hey, new fans and old fans, while you're here, why don't you take a second to subscribe to this show so that you don't have to find it manually every week, or that more importantly, we don't have to find you, you know what I'm saying? And or rate it with some stars and a review. Sure would appreciate that. Also, if you'd like, why don't you head over to paulollinger.com. That's their website for me. Ollinger is Ollinger, by the way. Paul is, well, if you don't know how to spell it, you're probably not listening to this podcast. Anyway, on that site, you can see that I've got links to my comedy EP, Alive on the Upper West Side, which is super hilarious, and you should check it out. Also have links to dates for my upcoming shows, which include this Friday, September 27th in Huntsville, Alabama, at the Epic Comedy Hour, and then next week at the Red Clay Comedy Festival in East Atlanta Village, October 4th and 5th, with Maria Bamford and Rory Scovel and a whole bunch of other hilarious killer acts. So you should go check that out, redclaycomedyfestival.com. Also, I'll be closing out on Saturday night the Urban Tree Cidery Show in West Midtown, Atlanta, Georgia. We'll be doing a lot of driving around on next Saturday night. Okay, let's talk about Dr. Laurie Santos. By the way, Princeton economist last week, Yale psychologist this week, Harvard, I'm coming for you, buddy. I'm going to come out. We're going to talk to those longitudinal happiness people, or Daniel Pinker, or Claudia Golden. I'm going to come talk to you all. So Cambridge, soon. Going to come. All right. Why do we want to talk to Dr. Laurie Santos? Well, for a lot of good reasons. One, she's dedicated to studying in her course, Psychology and Good Life, the most popular course in the history of Yale, as you learned just moments ago, how our brains help or interfere with us in our pursuit of happiness. Because our brains really are not good at predicting what will make us happy, which is really unfortunate. For example, we think that we want more money, more fame, or we want to be alone. But actually, these things don't make us as happy or happy at all, or as happy as we think they will. What will actually make us happy are more social connections, being more present, and being more grateful for the things we have in our lives. Dr. Santos' course teaches students to live happier, more fulfilling lives, which is really important at this time because college students are really more freaked out than ever. Rates of stress, rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts are higher than ever on college campuses, which is a bummer. And yeah, I diagnosed that pretty accurately, didn't I? It's a bummer. It's disconcerting. You wonder why that is. And we touch on that right up at the top of this conversation. Dr. Laurie Santos is associate professor at Yale University and head of Silliman College. She has 3 degrees from Harvard, where she graduated undergrad magna cum laude, and she earned her PhD. Just a few years ago, she was named one of 10 brilliant young scientists by Popular Science magazine. And this week, she launched a great new podcast called The Happiness Lab. If you like this podcast, you'll love hers. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Laurie Santos.
We were doing all this work with the animals showing, hey, some of these biases that make us make bad decisions and might make us unhappy seem to be shared with non-human animals too. And that might mean that they're built in. You know, the work we did with the monkeys show, the monkeys care what other monkeys are getting, and they won't like eating a delicious cucumber if they find out other monkeys have something more delicious like a grape. You know, this is built in by many years of evolution. But, you know, the monkeys don't have apps that are showing them what other people are getting in real time.
My name is Paul Ollinger. I'm a stand-up comedian with a background in the corporate world. I hit the lottery when I worked at a small company called Facebook. I'm fascinated with money, why we're so obsessed with it, and how it makes us happy or not. Welcome to Crazy Money. Dr. Laurie Santos, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be on the show.
So among many other things that you do in your life, you teach a class at Yale called Psychology and the Good Life, which is the most popular course in the history of Yale. Is there a correlation between its popularity and the fact that anxiety and depression among college kids is at an all-time high?
Well, we don't know that for sure, but it kind of certainly seems to be the case. This was the first time this class was ever taught. And like a typical class, you'd expect like 40 or 50 students to show up. I didn't think I would be teaching in a concert hall to a quarter of the students at Yale. So, I think students are voting with their feet. I think students don't like this culture of feeling anxious and depressed all the time. And I think they really wanted to do something about it.
What's different about college campuses or the young people on them today than 30 years ago? Are people just diagnosed more, or are their problems very different? Is their lifestyle very different than it was back in the good old uncomplicated 1980s and 90s?
I grew up in those uncomplicated days, and it wasn't, like it was this wonderful, psychological paradise or anything. But when you look at the rates of depression and anxiety on campuses today, like it feels really crazy and really different. So right now, nationally, over 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most of the time. So over 40% of students. Over 60% say that they feel anxious and very lonely most of the time. And 12% of college students nationally say they've seriously considered suicide in the last year. So things weren't perfect back in the day, but they were much better. And your question is kind of the million-dollar question, like what is different? What has changed in the last 20 years that has caused this mental health crisis to kind of skyrocket? And I think we don't really know the answer. They're the usual culprits where people point to things like technology, there's social media now, and there wasn't in the 90s.
That's right. Blame it all on Facebook. Okay.
Exactly. But the strange thing is that they're not great data. Social media is not fantastic, right? It does increase odds ratios of things like depression and anxiety, but it's not the magic bullet everyone thinks of. I think it's just that we're focused on the wrong stuff. Just in silly ways, right? Like in the college that I work at Yale, I'll walk into the dining hall and the students aren't talking to each other. They're all sitting there with their big headphones on, playing around on a screen. And it's like just that kind of dining hall chit chat. They don't have that in the same way that I had it back in the day. And so I think there's lots of subtle societal changes that we're not tracking, but they all collectively might be having a huge impact on our well-being.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get back to some of those topics, but I want to take a step back and talk about your research. According to Wikipedia, your research, and of course that's the truth, that the closest to divine truth that any of us can find in this life. According to Wikipedia, your research explores the evolutionary origins of the human mind by comparing the cognitive abilities of humans and non-human animals, including primates and canines. How does the study of dogs and monkeys relate to human happiness?
Well, there is not a direct connection. The happiness stuff emerged out of interacting with students, not necessarily my work. But I think the spot where it connects is all the work that we do with animals is really trying to get at this question of what makes the human mind special. And in particular, these kinds of things, looking at what are some of the biases that might be built in over evolutionary time that are messing us up. And in some of my early work, I tried to see whether monkeys were as bad at using money as humans are. Spoiler, they are. They're just as loss averse. They're just as bad at dealing with risk, and they're just as likely to rationalize their decisions as humans. So that's kind of, separate conversation. But basically, the idea is that we were doing all this work with the animals showing, hey, some of these biases that make us make bad decisions and might make us unhappy seem to be shared with non-human animals too. And that might mean that they're built in, which is a problem because it means if we want to do better in terms of monetary decisions or decisions that affect our happiness, we need to understand how the mind works so that we're not as messed up by all these biases that might be built in.
So we'll dig into each specific topic in a bit, but let's just say this podcast was 2 minutes long. Because I don't have time to go to Yale and take your amazing class, what can I do and what can our listeners do to live the happy and the good life?
I think the 2-minute version is to realize that your mind lies to you about what makes you happy, that we have all these intuitions about the things we should be doing. And by and large, a lot of those intuitions are wrong. And that's why listening to the long version of the podcast is better, because the science can really teach us what you should be doing to feel happier. And the fast version it's things like taking time for social connection, thinking about people who are not yourself, and spending time being mindful, just being in the present moment.
But Laurie, if we finish quickly, I'll have time to go do something else that will make me happier.
That's true, but the good news is that conversations like this, where we're actually socially connecting, is probably making you feel better too. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
So let's talk about why that is. I mean, we think that money or fame or recognition or someone else's love or affirmation will make us happy, but it's been proven that these things don't.
At least that they don't make us as happy as we think. We think that's all there is, but that's just not right.
So why do we pursue these things?
That's kind of an important question. I think we get this sense that doing more is always going to make us happier. Money, for example, we see people with more money and it feels like, oh, if I had more of that, like that would be much better. And for those of us that don't have much money, it's true. If you're living below the poverty line, you get a little bit more. That feels good. Problem is that it levels off and we don't realize that. And so you get people who we've talked to in our podcast who are earning, $50 million and they feel like, oh, I'm just not there yet. If I just get a little bit more, then I'll be good. So I think we develop these bad strategies over time, but we also have dumb features of our mind that mess us up. The reason $50 million doesn't make you happy is that you get used to it. Just like every new gadget you get, in a couple weeks, it's just this boring thing that's around you. You can kind of get used to having lots of money, having a great relationship. And that means that the happiness you get at the start of getting that thing isn't the same as the happiness you'll get months in or years into having it.
But those same instincts that moderate or calibrate our happiness, is that the word, that cap our happiness level? Mm-hmm. These instincts are also the same instincts that keep us alive and keep us from wanting to die when terrible things happen to us.
Yeah, I think it's good to be a creature that always strives for more. And I think that's what some of these intuitions, that's where some of these intuitions come from, right? It's like more. Like that's a smart thing for evolution to build in, not because it makes us happy, but because it makes us, constantly striving for more. And who knows, maybe there's more out there to get if we just got some energy. Like natural selection isn't trying to make us happy as individuals. It's just trying to make us survive and reproduce, right? But in the age of plenty, natural selection was trying to get us to get more money if we were earning, like $5,000 a year. But then once you get to a certain point, you can kind of chill out. But natural selection doesn't realize that. It can't just shut these intuitions off.
And then do we start looking for other types of rewards to get the brain feelies that we were getting from the previous stimuli?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you ask people the number one thing they think would make a person happy or would make them happy, they often say, oh, I want to change my life circumstances. I need a new job. I need more money. I need to move. I need a bigger house. So we're constantly looking for the next thing. And when we first get it, it feels great, but then we get used to that. But then we don't develop the intuition like, well, maybe the new thing wasn't what I needed. Maybe I need to do something else. We think, oh, I just must need another new thing. And that was a fascinating thing in the podcast, talking to people who interact with people who are super, super wealthy. We had this researcher, Clay Cockrell, he's a psychotherapist for the incredibly wealthy on the podcast. And so he only deals with people who earn more than $50 million. And they think, I have $50 million. I'm not happy, which, bracketed is already kind of crazy, but have $50 million, I'm not happy. So the problem must be, I just don't have enough yet. I just need a little bit more. But then, you always feel like you need more. So you're just on this treadmill, or what psychologists call this hedonic treadmill, where you're constantly running and getting used to the pace, but not realizing you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, I interviewed a guy named Brad Klontz, who is a financial psychologist for the ultra wealthy also. And his podcast episode will air on the 27th of August. This one is dropping on the 24th of September. So it will already have been out, but it is not out yet as of today. And one of the things he told me was that the rich have the same existential problems as the rest of us. They know how to pay their bills, but they're still looking for meaning in their life. And the one disadvantage they have is that they can't pretend that more money will make them happier.
That's right. Yeah.
They can't delude themselves with that.
Yeah. Or it's much harder to, right? Because they've seen the results of this. And they have other problems, right? It's called the 1% for a reason. Not many people are in that situation. So not only do you have all this money and you're not happy, but it's actually hard to connect with most of the people on the planet who are way less wealthy than you are. So they end up being more lonely than people of average incomes. They end up feeling less trustworthy of other people. If you have $50 million and somebody wants to start hanging out with you, your instant reaction isn't like, oh, I must be an interesting, fun person to hang out with. You're thinking, what are they trying to get out of me? Are they just using me for my money? And that can just kind of feel yucky socially.
So you started the podcast that launches on September 24th, which would be today for the listener if they're listening on the day this drops. It's called The Happiness Lab. Why did you want to do a podcast?
Well, we taught this live class at Yale that, 1 out of every 4 Yale students showed up to take. And it was like, I guess people want to hear more about happiness. Mm-hmm. And so then we said, all right, well, I'm a dorky professor. Let's put the version of this class up for free, so anybody can take it. And so that whole version of that class is up on Coursera.org. But, lo and behold, not everybody has time in their life to take a whole Yale class online. But people still want to know, what they can do to be happier. And so, as you've seen from doing this podcast, podcasts are a thing. People have time to listen to these things and get some quick tips. And so we thought, all right, let's just boil this whole Ivy League class down into a set of tips that people can listen to in a half hour and 45 minutes and just kind of give people a little bit of a way to learn about this stuff without taking a class, but in a way where they get some of the science so they understand how this stuff works, but also get some tips where they can put these scientific insights into practice.
I'd love to go back to Yale for a year or two. I think that'd be amazing.
Well, that's the thing is why it's so striking to see these students who are, many of them just seem so unhappy. It's like you're 19, you've kind of hit the college lottery. You're at Yale University. You have your whole life ahead of you. And you're lonely, 2/3 of you are anxious, a 10th of you are probably contemplating suicide right now. That's crazy. So
yeah. I don't know why that is. I guess there's a narrative we all construct for our past and everything. I don't remember feeling like that in college. I do remember having to make trade-offs in terms of if I spend all this time reading this one thing, I'm not going to have time to dive into this other thing, whether that was another course or a party that I wasn't going to get to go to. And I usually chose the party, by the way. But it seems like the course load or just everything that's going on in their lives is just that much more amped up than it was.
Yeah, I think that there's a sense that everything is more amped up. And I think that comes from something that they face that we don't face right now or that we didn't face in college, which is all this stuff on social media. Mm-hmm. When you took the opportunity cost the other direction and you didn't go to the party and you stayed home and studied, you didn't have Snapchat telling you in a moment-by-moment detail every amazing thing you were missing out on.
Right.
So the students talk about this FOMO, this fear of missing out, and I think it's real for them in a way that we just didn't have it broadcast to us back in the 90s. And that is powerful. There's so much research showing that our objective circumstances don't really affect our happiness that much. It's the circumstances we're comparing against other people. So it's not the amount of money you have that makes you happy. It's your amount of money relative to other people. And you see this in so many different domains. The quickest way to make somebody unhappy with their sex life is to tell them that other people in their age range are having more sex than them. You could be perfectly happy with your sex life, but you find out other people are having more sex, you're like, oh my God, my sex life is miserable. And that's true for sex lives, it's true for salaries, it's true for grades, it's true for how many parties you go to and so on. And so again, I think this is just part of human nature. In fact, the work we did with the monkeys show the monkeys care what other monkeys are getting, and they won't like eating a delicious cucumber if they find out other monkeys have something more delicious like a grape. This is built in by many years of evolution. But, the monkeys don't have apps that are showing them what other people are getting in real time, and apps that are curated like Instagram to look more awesome than they even need to be, right?
Right.
This was... Yeah.
It's not even a real comparison. You're comparing your reality, warts and all, to somebody else's curated version of what their life should look like in their brain.
And this is the thing, another spot where our mind kind of lies to us is we know that rationally, but when you scroll through the feed, it's hard to remember that those images you saw could be photoshopped, or that person's posting the party pics, but not, the 4 nights in the week that they stayed in and studied for econ midterm. We know it rationally, but it's really hard to wrap our mind around it. And this is one of the things we teach and we talk about in the podcast is just all these data showing that, we think we get it, but in practice, we don't get it at all. And just a couple funny data points. One is people who watch TV more often, especially people who watch TV about kind of reality shows and all these rich folks, they actually think their real income buys less than people who watch less TV. In fact, people who watch TV spend on average $4 more than people who don't watch TV a lot. And it's because if you watch lots of TV, you see lots of rich people, you just feel like you need to start keeping up with the Joneses.
Oh my gosh.
You can't help it, There's also these lovely data showing that when we make predictions about all the good and bad things in other people's lives, we have this bias to downplay the bad things in other people's lives. So nobody out there got a bad grade like me. Nobody out there was home studying like me. But we upgrade all the good things. So more people than me went to good parties and so on. And so it's not just that we mispredict. We mispredict in exactly the direction that will make us feel the worst.
Yeah, I can see that. I've had the pleasure of listening to 3 of your episodes because I'm super important and get early access to this kind of thing. So I want to dive into some of the themes. All 3 were very interesting, but one of them was called Silver Lining, and it's about the silver medal syndrome. Can you explain what that is briefly, please?
Yeah, so it's a funny thing that researchers notice that maybe you've noticed if you watch lots of sports and Olympics and things, which is that, if you look on the Olympic winning stand, obviously the gold medalist is super psyched, smiling a lot. But there are 2 things that seem weird. One is that the bronze medalist is often just as psyched as the gold medalist, like smiling just as heavily, even though they got 3rd place. But what's more shocking is the silver medalist, who just found out they're 2nd place in the world, often doesn't look just less happy, but looks actively miserable. Mm-hmm. Like they're frowning, they're angry. And in recent times, as this has been picked up even more, you get silver medalists like Jocelyn Roque, who threw her medal off in the middle of the stand. Medalists like Michaela Maroney, who's the famous one who made the face that turned into a meme on the stand, where she kind of made this sort of snide face, all angry, and then people photoshopped her into the moon landing and all this stuff. Silver medalists are just downright miserable, even though they just won an Olympic medal. And so psychologists trying to figure out what's going on. Turns out that it's what they're doing is they're comparing their own happiness against this one salient comparison point, this one reference point that makes them feel awful, the gold medalist. There's one person up there that beat them, and that person is so salient it makes them feel miserable. And so the podcast is really about, that's Olympic medalists on the stand, but how often do we do that with our salary or with our social life or with everything we go through, where objectively things are good, but we make ourselves feel miserable just because somebody else is a little bit better?
So does Teddy Roosevelt have it right when he says that comparison is the thief of joy?
Yeah, I think he was incredibly prescient. I don't know how many Olympic gold medalists he watched from the president chair, but yeah, I think that's right. I think on the one hand, it's the thief of joy, but it's something we can't shut off. Our brains are just built to do those comparisons. And so one of the things we teach about in the podcast is well, if you're going to do the comparison anyway, then try to do it right. Try to look to somebody who has a little bit less than you.
Right.
Try to find a comparison that doesn't make you feel so awful all the time.
What are the evolutionary reasons that we have that cognitive bias to look at somebody with more?
Well, we have lots of cognitive biases that don't necessarily make us happy. One is we just have a negativity bias in general. Our minds are just drawn to all the bad stuff. And you can watch this yourself. Scroll through a news feed and watch what piques your attention. Mm-hmm. It's not wholesome this, wholesome that. It's horrible thing happening. That will pop out. That's your negativity bias. And so we're constantly looking for reference points that make us feel bad. But there's something bigger too, which is that, it's probably good for evolution if we're constantly striving. If there's, a big tree with lots of food out there that somebody else got, we should know about that. So next time that could be us. And that means we're constantly setting our sights on people who are doing better than us in all these different domains. It might be good for getting the best tree evolutionarily, but it really sucks for our happiness. And so we can kind of train our brains to do a little bit better. We can consciously find these comparisons that make us feel a little bit better, or at least try to get rid of all the comparisons that make us feel awful.
These things are not just individual biases, they're societal, and you see it in the media all the time where the news is, if it bleeds, it leads. And so we're not only inclined to think that way, we are inclined to be led that way. And being aware of that maintaining an awareness of that is difficult to do.
I think that's right. And I think it's getting even trickier, right, with the fact that, it's not just, some editor at the New York Times that's deciding what things we see in a news feed. It's an algorithm that Facebook is providing or Instagram is providing, right? And those algorithms don't care about your well-being. They just want your eyeballs to pay as much attention as possible. So you better believe they're going to find the best vacation pics, the most salient negative things out there, And this is one of the reasons that, again, people's anxiety increases when they do things like look at a lot of Facebook and so on. You can do these randomized controlled designs, which are the sort of scientists' best strategy, where you kind of randomly assign people to have more Facebook in their life or less Facebook. And what you find is people's well-being moves around accordingly. Like those news feeds that are picking up the most salient comparisons aren't making us happier. If anything, they're making us feel a little worse.
Right. Let's talk a little bit specifically about money and the way this one cognitive bias affects us. People would rather have less money and be relatively well off compared to their peers than to have more money and to be less well off relative to their peers. That seems twisted to me.
It's twisted. We'd give up money to be better than everybody else. We'd give up absolute purchasing power to be the best off in our office, say, have the best salary in our office, which in some ways is just absolutely mental, right? Like that we'd give up our own resources to one-up other people. It just shows how deeply irrational some of these biases really are.
How does that show up, and how do we stay on top of that bias to keep ourselves from falling into this trap?
Well, one of the things that we preach a lot in the Happiness Lab is just know that these biases are there, right? Because they're going to be chugging along as we make our daily decisions and go about our life. If you know that they're there, then you can try to think about situations that might trip them up or not. You could realize that seeing everybody's, amazing vacation photos that my salary can't buy, that's not going to feel great. And so maybe I should just avoid that part of the feed and not look at it, for example. Another is to just realize that we have these biases when it comes to money, that if we see other people who are richer than us, it's going to affect how we feel about our own salary. So maybe don't tell a whole office what everybody's making, because that's not going to make people feel good. It's going to make people feel bad. Find ways to pay a little bit more attention to other reference points. A few of these websites have these little things you could enter your salary and find out if you're in the 1%. And while not that many of us are in the 1% of the United States, if you take a look at the real poverty that exists in the world, many of us are in the 1% when it comes to the world, or close, top 10% or something. And I think that comparison can really remind people wait, hang on, my comparison doesn't have to be some incredibly wealthy person with $50 million. My comparison could be, the refugee that doesn't have a roof over their head tonight or doesn't have their family with them. And so I think when we have the power to consciously control our reference points. And once we start doing that, we can start feeling a lot better.
You compared some silver medalists who valued their prize to those who felt completely dissatisfied with their prize. What are the traits, the positive, the optimistic ones demonstrated relative to the others?
Yeah, this is a move that we do a lot in the Happiness Lab where, really I'm thinking of this whole podcast as a journey to find people who are doing it right? Most silver medalists fall prey to this, but can I find ones that don't do this at all? And what strategies are they using? And in this case, I was lucky enough to talk with figure skating legend Michelle Kwan, who is herself a silver medalist, but was heralded even back then as just being so magnanimous when she won this medal, and she was smiling. Even her fans were distraught that she lost the gold because she was kind of slated to win the gold, but she seemed fine. And so I talked with her about what happened, and it was interesting. She had this other reference point that made her not feel so bad, and that was her sister. Her sister was also a young figure skating legend. She didn't get as famous as Michelle. And I think Michelle had that comparison in mind, which was she was kind of always doing better than her sister, but also this idea that she didn't ever want her sister to feel bad about what was happening. And so Michelle thought, the right way to do that is to not compare myself against other people. It's just to compare myself against myself. She used herself and her past successes as a reference point. And that's exactly right. As long as we're beating what we used to do before, we're going to be improving, but not necessarily at the cost of feeling bad by comparing ourselves with other people. The other thing is that Michelle wasn't really doing it for a medal or some sort of outcome. She was skating just because she loved it. It was so beautiful. In the podcast, she talked about what it felt like to skate over the Olympic rings and how she was crying. It just became clear that she just loved the moment and she loved the grind of it, right? She just loved skating. And I think that's a message for all of us, because we fall into the silver medal trap when what we're going for isn't, the kind of thing we get out of having a lot of money. It's just having a specific number. And when you have the specific number in mind, that can be less than somebody else's specific number. But it's hard to compare, the happiness that you get from sitting on your nice porch that you worked for versus somebody else's nice porch. You can pay attention more to the things that allow you to feel good rather than some objective number. And that was what Michelle did really well. And kind of what I took away from that episode, how often am I doing things just for the accolade at the end or just for the number at the end? That's not the best way to live if you want to maximize your well-being.
Well, now you're just talking crazy talk, Laurie. I mean,
no,
you're clearly not. You're not American, Laurie. What's going on here?
I'm a commie professor. No, I mean, my students hear this and they think, don't pay attention to the grade at the end. Pay attention to the learning. Like, are you crazy? And it's like, no, that's why we designed educational systems. It wasn't about the B+. It was that I wanted you to learn math, and we can get lost when we kind of get in that wrong way of thinking.
Yeah, a lot of the people whose writing I enjoy and talk about success, they talk about focusing on process and not on outcomes. Because for one thing, that's all you can control. Michelle Kwan couldn't control what the other skaters did, and one of them had, is it Tara Lipinski, who skated the greatest routine in Olympic history or something, even though Michelle Kwan had like a 99.9,
Yeah.
Tara came out and got 100. She can't control that.
That's right. Yeah, and I think it's two things. One is that, you can control the process, but not the outcome. But it's also that social comparison doesn't work as well in the process. It's hard to compare whether I love skating over the Olympic rings better than you love skating over the Olympic rings, because that's just not salient. But a gold medal versus a silver medal is easily compared. So kind of focusing on the journey means that bias that we have to compare with others, you just can't do it as well because there's just like no metric. And so we kind of escape this bias that keeps us trapped in feeling bad about ourselves by focusing on the journey.
Why does winning the lottery ruin people's lives?
I think the problem is like when we imagine what it would feel like to win the lottery, we kind of imagine the wrong things. We imagine, sitting in a bathtub filled with money and telling our bosses, to go to hell. And we don't imagine what the consequences are going to be for the real people in our lives. It might be hard for our buddy that we got a drink with to still hang out with us at the same restaurants at that point. We forget our family's going to come out of the woodwork and ask for money. We forget that we're going to have tax paperwork that feels way more of a pain in the butt than the tax paperwork we pay for now. And this is a general problem, which is that we have this machinery that allows us to simulate what different circumstances would be like, but we often simulate wrong. When we think of the lottery, we simulate all the good things, but we don't simulate any of the bad stuff, some of which is really profound, especially in terms of increasing our loneliness and these kinds of things. But the same is true for the bad stuff, it turns out. When you simulate having a car crash or losing one of your limbs or losing a job or something like that, you simulate all the bad stuff. That's what's salient. But you forget that sometimes opportunities can come from it. And that's a very funny thing. It means because of these biases in our simulation machinery, we often get the consequences of real life circumstances, both seemingly good ones and seemingly bad ones, more wrong than we think.
You interviewed a war veteran who had been horribly injured in an ATV accident, and his story is pretty compelling.
Yeah, this is J.R. Martinez, who, deployed off to Iraq right after 9/11. He's 19. He's just super excited to help his country. And a few days into being in Iraq, his Humvee explodes and he's trapped in it for minutes while it's burning. And so at the end of that, he has, third-degree burns over 3/4 of his body. He's in surgeries for, I think, about the next 3 years, basically skin grafts and all this stuff. He loses his 20s basically to hospitals. And you ask him, would you change anything? Would you do, that was so horrible, would you do it differently? And what he says is, no way, all of that was a blessing. That was a gift in my life, which is not what people predict. But then he walks through it and he says, that gave me meaning. It gave me a path that allowed me to have these scars that let me communicate in a way that's different. People pay attention to me because of these horrible scars. And he used that in these wonderful ways. He became a motivational speaker. He wrote a book. He even wound up on Dancing with the Stars. It just completely changed his life in a positive way. But if I ask most of your listeners, hey, would you want to deploy to Iraq and be in a Humvee and get, your Humvee explodes and you have burns over 3/4 of your body? We predict that would not just suck, but it would be truly awful. It would ruin my life. And that's really profound. It means some of the most horrible things we can imagine happening to us can actually happen to us, and it won't be as bad as we think.
But how much of that is just rationalization? I mean, it's the reverse game your brain is playing, saying, and I think there's even a bias in ownership of, I've read about this thing, that there's a bias in ownership of items where you place a higher value on an item that you already own. Is the same true with your life circumstances? Evolutionarily, we kind of have to rationalize the bad that happens to us lest we slide off into this "it's too bad to live with" syndrome.
It is definitely true that some of this is rationalization, right? But we forget that we have that power. We forget that when things go bad, we're just going to rationalize it anyway. And the key is that if you look at the happiness that comes from rationalization, your partner leaves you and you're like, oh, he was never meant for me in the first place. I really love life without him and so on. But if you look at the happiness I get from that loser, I hated his family, all this stuff, right? But if you look at the happiness I get from those rationalizations, it is indistinguishable in terms of all the scientific instruments we have from the happiness I would get if that loser never left me, right? The simulated happiness we create from our rationalizations feels just as good as the real happiness we get from seemingly awesome events in our lives. Researcher Dan Gilbert, who's a professor at Harvard who I interviewed for this episode, he's fond of saying the happiness that you get when she says yes is just as good as the happiness you simulate when she says no. They're both equivalent. And when you realize that, it's incredibly powerful. How often do we go through life not taking risks because we're afraid of the bad consequences? If rationalization is just going to kick in and make it good anyway, maybe I should take the risk. Maybe I should be a little freer with how I make my decisions. Maybe I'm holding myself back from fears about how I'm going to react that would never come true because of how rationalization works.
Is one of the lessons here to both not covet and not worry? Because the stuff you don't have that you're going to get won't make you happy. The terrible things that might happen to you aren't going to ruin your life unless they kill you, in which point you don't have to worry about it anyway. We're just creating all our own happiness and stress in between our ears.
I think that's what the research really suggests, right? Especially when I look at my college students who are, so worried about this one grade that's going to affect their whole life. And I can see that's just not going to matter. Or as soon as you get that grade, what the data suggests is you're going to rationalize it. The professor was stupid. I never liked English anyway, blah, blah, blah. And you're just going to be fine. And so we spend a lot of energy going after stuff we think is going to make everything great, but it won't work the way we think. And avoiding stuff we're so terrified is going to ruin everything, but it's not going to. So we end up wasting a lot of emotional energy that could be spent on better stuff, kind of freaking out about stuff that's not really going to matter ultimately.
You talk about how one of the most important elements of living happy life is meaningful social connections, and yet many of us are programmed to avoid them.
Yeah, this is a thing I see a lot. And one of the biggest, especially when I teach my class, one of the biggest spots where I get pushback, because all the data suggests that happy people just spend more time with others. They spend more time with their friends and people they care about, but they also just physically spend more time around other people. But if you talk to most people don't think that's the case. Most people think if I could just avoid my coworkers, avoid talking to people, make things as seamless as possible, my life would be better. And you also see this playing out in technology. Every new store I go to has a different mechanism that I could order something online and not talk to a cashier, not talk to a barista. I just walk in and grab my coffee because I've already paid for it through some app. But that's these little moments in life where we get to kind of just have some small talk with somebody. We predict it would be better if we just got rid of that. But in practice, what the research shows is that we're wrong. We're actually happy having those little small conversations, even if we don't think that's the case. And so in the podcast, I interview this one researcher, Nick Epley, who does these really funny experiments on this where he forces people to talk to random complete strangers. He forces people on their commute in Chicago to talk to the person sitting next to them on the train.
He's the devil. He's the devil,
yeah. People do it because you offer them a $10 Starbucks gift card and people will do anything. They're like, yes, I want it so bad. I'll talk to some random person. But no, people predict this is going to be not just kind of not good, but actively awful. It's going to actively suck and be super awkward and so on. But when people really do it, they feel better. Their commute feels more positive. They actually get just as much work done. And the data suggests it's just as powerful an effect for introverts as it is for extroverts, which is not what we predict. This is the one study that when I presented, I actually get pushback. When I first talked about this work on Twitter, all these people were tweeting at me talk to strangers or you're crazy. Didn't your mom ever teach you anything? It was just this barrage of people saying I was wrong. And that's because our intuitions are so strong. Even my intuitions are strong about this. I'm from the Northeast. I'm a Yankee girl at heart. I feel talking to strangers on the street just will feel awful. But I know the research that's just not the case. And so I try to kind of push myself even more to be social, even when I'm not feeling like it. And, in practice, if I really think about how it makes me feel, it actually does make me feel better.
When I left work, when I quit going to the office every day, I found myself to be extremely lonely. And that was one of the many unanticipated consequences of bailing on my job. It was something I never even considered. So I just started spending a whole lot of time on chat roulette, and that made me feel a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news.
That was a joke. That was a joke, Laurie.
It depends on which rooms in chat roulette, but
Sure.
what you're showing to other people. But I think this is a thing that we see in a lot of people's changing business lives, right? Like a lot of people are choosing to work at home, which has all these benefits in terms of commute and so on. But we forget that simple social connection with the people around us matters a lot. And this is what's really tricky. And one of the reasons I think the podcast is so important is we're designing systems and societies that are based on our intuitions about what's going to make us happy, right? Like, oh, I'll work from home. That'll kind of be better for my well-being. But we might be wrong. And if we have these incorrect intuitions, like it means we're going to design things that are making us feel worse and worse. I think about this when I see my students in the dining hall with their big headphones. They made a choice. Like, I'm going to sit there with my big headphones, listen to some, I don't know, Diplo or something. It'll be great, right? And then that's their prediction. But they're probably taking away something that really does matter for their well-being. We forget the opportunity cost.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I mean, I think I might have scored slightly higher in some of my tests if I had noise-canceling headphones on in the library that kept me from being distracted by the person chewing gum next to me or the pretty girl walking in front of me. I mean,
that's right.
There's some balance there.
That's right. I mean, it's not saying like drop all your alone time forever and talk to everyone, right? But on balance, like we probably want to err more on the side of social connection than we think we do. And that's even true for introverts. The data suggests that introverts have a worse prediction. Like they really predict it's going to suck, but when they actually do it, it's kind of just as good as it is for extroverts.
Speaking of introverts, you almost step over the line in making some dangerous stereotypes about engineers that some people might find offensive.
Well, these stereotypes actually came from a source I didn't expect. We got to interview musician David Byrne from the Talking Heads. My 80s music head almost like exploded getting to talk to him. But he's been pushing, I mean, he's kind of seen it in music, how we've moved away from being social with music. Even think of like concerts nowadays. Like, if you go to a concert recently, it's not like, everybody clapping in unison with the band. It's like everybody holding up a tiny screen that they're watching it through this tiny square. And like, even as a musician, he says he looks out and he just sees a sea of like cell phones. He doesn't see like the people screaming and stuff. And then you think of like, back in the 90s when you like meet a new person or go over to their apartment, first thing you do is like look at their CD case, right? See what kind of music they listen to. Now it's like buried in people's Spotify playlists, right? You just don't see it as much. And so we're kind of getting less social with music, but he's really worried we're getting less social with everything. And his kind of diss of the engineers, as you mentioned, is that he really thinks that, engineers tend not to be the kind of people that are really as social. At least that's our stereotype. But they're the ones that are designing these algorithms. They're the ones who are designing apps that let us, buy our groceries without leaving the house or ever talking to anybody. And they might want a kind of social interaction that might not work for everybody.
Well, I think that's one of the things you mentioned, the lack of CD cases. In the past on a plane, you see somebody reading the new book. It's a clear, non-threatening way to open a conversation with somebody that lets them know, hey, I'm at least smart enough to read, if nothing else.
Yes.
It doesn't mean I'm not a psychopath, but it's like an open social cue that you don't have anymore because I don't know what's on the other side of somebody's Kindle. And it's a bigger step for me to take to say, what are you reading? And then you feel like you're being intrusive.
Yeah. And especially if people have the headphones on and they're sitting there, right? And this is one of the things that Nick Epley, this researcher, finds is that two reasons people don't talk to others is one, there's this startup cost, right? If you can see the front of their book, it's just easier. And our technology has made that startup cost a little higher. But the second reason is that we look at other people and they seem engrossed by their screens, right? Because nobody has a bored moment, say, in a line anymore. Like if I'm waiting in line for coffee, it's not obvious that I want to talk to anyone because 2 seconds into this line, I'm bored and I've whipped out my phone and I'm like scrolling through a Reddit feed or something, right? And so we look at other people like, oh, well, they probably don't really want to talk to us. They look so engrossed in their boring Reddit feed, right? And so we don't engage. And so the technology we have, which quickly distracts us, means we're not as available for interacting with other people. And later in the podcast, later in the season, I interview this woman, Liz Dunn, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia. And she's been looking at what technology does to our social interactions. And she finds that when people have their phones out, even if they're not using them, but their phone is just present, they smile at the people around them 30% less. which seems so striking, but you kind of get it. Like if your phone is there, you're just kind of distracted. You're just less available for a conversation.
Yeah. It seems like it's a downward cycle, which is only going to accelerate because there's kind of no escaping unless you break the whole system.
And that's what's really crazy. I mean, in the podcast, Liz has this analogy. She's like, imagine, because this comes up in it's one thing if I just don't talk to the people in line next to me near a coffee, but it's another if I don't like talk to my husband or my kids over the dinner table, right? And she uses this analogy of like, imagine if to the dinner table I brought this big wheelbarrow that was full of, printouts of all of my emails and printouts of every articles and like, big audio CDs, or like a CD player of every podcast in the history of the world. And it was just like piled like every cat video on DVD that I could ever watch, right? And she's like, if you had that wheelbarrow full of all that stuff, it would be really distracting. Like you wouldn't be able to talk to your partner at the dinner table because you'd be like, oh my God, like let me look at these cat videos, right? She's like, your brain knows that on the other end of that phone is all that stuff, right? So it's going to just be slightly more distracted than you expect. And that's what's super scary. We've put these distracting wheelbarrows in the pockets of 6 billion people around the planet. And that's just what we have now. If you think about what that wheelbarrow is going to look like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, like it's going to be amazing if we ever have a conversation at the dinner table rather than play on our phones. And so I think, now that we're a species that gets so much good stuff out of technology, we need to start thinking seriously about what the bad stuff looks like too, and how to kind of balance in real life with all the amazing things we get online.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting to watch it evolve, but let's get back to your happiness class. I want to get an A in your class, Laurie. More importantly, I want to earn an A by the way I live. What do I need to do to live a happier life?
I think the top 3 tips that you get from the science are first, be more social, even when you don't feel like it. Talk to people, make time for the people you care about. Just like try to fill your social calendar with as much real social connection as you can. Second thing is to be a little bit more other-oriented. These days we have a lot of this idea of self-care or kind of treat yourself. Research shows that that's just completely wrong. Like happy people are more other-oriented. So think about when you kind of want to get happier yourself, think about what you can do to make others happy. It's counterintuitive, but it works. It works much better. And then the third thing, which sounds so cheesy and hippy-dippy, is just to take more time to be present. Just time off that you're not kind of scheduled, but also just time to like notice and breathe and just be. I think people who do those 3 things tend to just statistically be much happier than the rest of us that don't.
Okay, get specific though. Like what? Like I hear you're saying like broad categories of things, but like what's something I can do today?
So get specific. So today you're going to walk out and head to the Starbucks, and there's going to be a line, and your instinct is going to be to pull out your phone and look at something stupid on social media or on the internet. Don't do that. If you have your headphones in, even if you're listening to podcasts, hit pause for a second, take your headphones out, and have a meaningful conversation with the person who's next to you. And really try to get deep. Don't just like, hey, the weather, like ask them something interesting. Like ask them, like, and people have clothing on, they have stuff that you can comment on, like really try to dig deep. The next time you're feeling bad, you're kind of feeling, you've gone on social media and you're kind of feeling mopey, think about what you could do for someone else. That could be like, send your friend a text and see how they're doing, or like, call your family or something. Like, explicitly do something nice for somebody else. If you're desperate, go on to one of like the many charity sites and just give like $2 to somebody out there in need. Instantly, that will make you feel much better than if you tried to like take time for self-care. And then on the breathing side, like just whatever you're doing now, again, hit pause on the playlist and just take 2 seconds to like breathe. Just breathe in and just breathe out and just like feel what it feels like to be you. And that sounds so cheesy, but it can be the reset that we need. Just 5 to 10 minutes a day of doing that, either in a real meditation practice or just like taking time to breathe, can statistically improve your well-being.
Which part of your own advice do you have the hardest time following?
Oh, all the things. I mean, I teach about these bad intuitions because I have so many of them myself. One of my favorite stories about this is that, because I'm now preaching, you should talk to strangers all the time on all these things, and I get so much pushback for it. But I still have a hard time doing it myself. And I was on a flight recently and hadn't spoken to the guy. It was like a flight to California. I was on this for like 6 hours, and this guy was sitting next to me for 6 hours, perfectly reasonable seeming human being. Didn't say a word to him. And I got an email from a journalist I'd been talking to, and she told me this wonderful story about how she didn't want to talk to this person on this plane next to her, but then they talked, and then they got to know each other, and now their kids hang out, and thank you so much, and I realized, like, I've just been sitting on this plane for 6 hours and I haven't followed my own advice. And I was like, oh, okay. And I like talked to the guy and then it turned out to be great. So for me, it's a lot of them. I think the ones that are biggest, I would have to say are kind of this time for breathing and mindfulness. The class has been great. The podcast has been great, but it makes me really busy. And so making sure I have time to kind of be free is really tricky and takes a lot of active work. But I can tell that when I do it, I feel happier.
How do you keep yourself on task there?
One is I have this like automatic email where I explain to, if people are asking me to do meetings or like talk or meet up, I often will send them this email. It's like, no, I can't do that. And the reason is like, I preach about this power of time affluence, this idea of having free time. And if I say yes to every single one of these, I can't do it. So I know frankly, I know I sound like a bitch, but like, and I like, it's like, too elitist professor to not talk to you. But like, if I don't say no to this, I'm going to not protect my time and space. And people actually react pretty well to that. They're like, oh my God, I love that. Like, I'm going to use that myself. But that takes a lot of active work.
Tell me how you taught your students about time affluence.
Oh, so that was particularly good because so time affluence is just this idea that when we feel like we have free time, that can really improve our well-being. It's not the objective amount of free time we have. It's kind of a feeling. This is why if you're at work and some meeting gets canceled, you show up at the meeting like, oh, is that meeting? It's like, oh, it got canceled. And you realize you have a free half hour that it just feels amazing. Like you feel like you could learn a new language or like a new sport. You just kind of, it's only a half hour, but it just feels like so amazing. But I thought this was going to be really ironic to teach my students about because they're so time strapped. One of the national surveys suggests that 87% of college students feel time overwhelmed like a lot of the time. Like most of their time feels time overwhelmed for 87% of students. And so I thought, I don't want to contribute to this time famine. Let me give the students some free time. So students came to class on this day when I was supposed to be teaching them about time affluence. And I revealed when they arrived that there was no class that day. So I kind of gave them this canceled meeting phenomena. And what was amazing, the students freaked out. One of them started playing like God's Plan by Drake and there was like music and everyone was really happy. But what was amazing was 2 students burst into tears when I announced this. And one of the students who burst into tears said it was the first free hour and a half she's had all semester. Which again, these Yale students are extreme in some cases, but I think we can all feel like that, where it's like we just haven't had a free moment. And what we forget is often we caused that. We chose to fill our schedules that packed. But, you can do that yourself. And so to your listeners, a practical way to do this is, maybe not in your calendar this week, but if you have like an online calendar, go like a month from now and just carve out an hour that just says time affluence and put it in your calendar. And I promise when you get to that 1 hour that you've carved out for yourself, it will feel amazing.
And the best part of that is you can always just cancel the time affluence and replace it with a meeting when it comes up.
You cross out email, it's like, that's why the surprise move works best. What you really want is for some assistant or for some good friend of yours to put it in the calendar and then cancel it on you at the last minute. That's why it works more powerfully.
That's funny. Laurie, the new podcast is called Happiness Lab. Where can our listeners find it?
You can check it out wherever you get your podcasts. If you just Google the Happiness Lab, you should get it. And hopefully it will help you in the way that the class has helped all my students.
Is there any other place on the internet you'd like to direct their attention?
The Happiness Lab podcast sites are fantastic. So anywhere on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want the more in-depth version, you can check out our online class, which you can get on Coursera.org. It's called The Science of Wellbeing. But my guess is for most of your listeners, start with the podcast and go from there.
If I take the Coursera course, do I get a Yale sweatshirt?
I can send you a Yale sweatshirt. How about that?
That would be amazing.
But you got to follow all the tips. You got to achieve the happiness, not the grade.
Laurie, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Laurie Santos of Yale and the Happiness Lab. Best of luck with all your work in the future.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Santos. I appreciate your time and I enjoyed that conversation. Hey, folks, if you like what we're doing here at Crazy Money, sure would appreciate it if you took the time to share this with your friends and or subscribed on whatever app you're listening to this on. That's a double preposition, but you know what I'm saying. Subscribe on that there app. Leave us a rating. Write a review. Tell us what we're doing right. Tell us what we're doing wrong. Go to my website, paulollinger.com, and you can subscribe to a newsletter. That's going to be awesome, and will fill your inbox with goodness once a week as soon as I start doing it. Thanks again to my editor and producer there, Mike Carano out in Los Angeles, California. Hey, we haven't talked for a while. Call me. Bye.